Hello and welcome everyone to today's Meet the Author online event. And thank you all for your patience as we have had to navigate a little bit of technical difficulties. I am Debbie Cohn. I'm the Interim Director of the College Arts and Humanities Institute at Indiana University Bloomington. And I am delighted to have you all with us here today, even more so than I was 15 minutes ago. I'm also very excited to introduce today's speaker to you. Jeff Gould is a distinguished professor in the history department, as well as a Rudy Professor of History. His scholarship on Central America includes books such as To Lead as Equals, Rural Protests and Political Consciousness in Chinandega, Nicaragua, To Die in This Way, Nicaraguan Indian Communities and the Myth of Mestizaje, and To Rise in Darkness, Revolution, Repression, and Memory in El Salvador. He has also crucially produced documentaries such as Scars of Memory, El Salvador, and Port Triumph, the latter of which complements and supplements his most recent book, Solidarity Under Siege, Solidarity and Discord in the Salvadoran Labor Movement. Jeff's accomplishments have been recognized with the Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Award, and being a fellow at Harvard's Charles Warren Center, among other honors. It is a testament to his dedication to Latin American and Caribbean studies at IU that he actually deferred taking his Guggenheim to accommodate his work as director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, which he did with great commitment, securing several Title VI grants for the program between 1995 and 2008. Indeed, this dedication was reflected in his receiving the campus's John W. Ryan Award for Distinguished Contributions to International Programs and Studies in 2013. Now, Jeff will speak about his book. He will show several clips from his documentary. If you have questions, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the meeting, and we will, so please feel free to leave questions on the Facebook feed, and I will be able to share them with Jeff. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Gould, who will speak to us today, May Day, about Solidarity Under Siege and Port Triumph. Thanks. Jeff.
Thanks, Deb, for that introduction. And yes, it is May Day, and I wanted to remind people that there is a nationwide strike of Amazon, Target, Walmart, Instacart workers, and that they asked for at least a one-day boycott. I'm going to be employing 4 Spanish words. I'm just going to mention them up front. One is Sindicato Tierra, which refers to the packing house workers union, the shrimp packing house workers union. Sindicato Agua, which refers to the fishermen's union. And then Desencuentro, which briefly I'll synthesize as a reference to misunderstandings and disagreements. And then finally, referred to Pesca S.A., and Pesca is the name of the largest company, and S.A. just means Sociedad Anónima or incorporated. So I wanted to briefly discuss how I got interested in this topic, and it goes a little far back in my life. During the 1970s, I was a labor organizer, for a while a rank and file organizer in a factory organized by the United Auto Workers, and then subsequently I was an organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in upstate New York. And ultimately that experience with the labor movement culminated in a romance on the factory floor that then led to a marriage to my wife, Ellie, and then we returned when I got fired from the union. That's another story. We returned to her native Costa Rica. So 4 years later, when I went to graduate school, those interests, both labor and living in Central America, led me to do work on the history of labor and peasant movements in northwestern Nicaragua. And then subsequently, I continued to do research, but primarily about peasants in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And then after completing a film, La Palabra en el Bosque, on the impact of liberation theology on a group of peasants in northeastern Salvador, I decided to complement that research with a study of the Salvadoran labor movement. Now, in all of my work, I combined a case study, a very local study or studies, with national level phenomena, often social struggles of peasants, say, with an analysis of the impact of those struggles on national level politics and society and their interrelationship. And so as I began work on archival work on the Salvadoran labor movement in the 1970s and 1980s, I came across an article about a strike of fishermen. And that caught my attention because I had also worked as a red snapper fisherman in the Gulf of Mexico for a memorable 30 days and 30 nights. And when I came across that article, I thought, you know, that's almost impossible, because my memories of working on a fishing boat were like, these are the last people in the world who are going to want to get unionized. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to start working in this community, or try to work in this community. And then I decided at the same time that I wanted to make a film, that I wanted the book to be accompanied by a film. My third book was accompanied by a film in one way or another, and I decided to try and do that. So I set out and organized a film crew, and reflecting on it, I realized that I never really would have done this book research if I hadn't also been doing the film, because I got a sense of security, however illusory, from being with a bunch of people, like 4 or 5 other people, because this town, little did I know, turned out to be gang-ridden. And I just wouldn't have done it on my own. So with that, I'd like to share with you the first few minutes of the film and then go back to discussing the book. So Alex, could we move to that? Hopefully this will work.
Mi juventud desde la edad de 11 años la dejé en Pesca SADCB. Trabajé toda mi vida allí. Allí dejé toda mi tipotada, mi niñez.
Por ser dirigentes nos andaban matando, persiguiendo. Fue el motivo de que nosotros salimos huyendo sin deber nada de nuestro país.
Mi nombre es Alejandro Molina Lara. Después de muchos años, estoy regresando al Puerto El Triunfo, El Salvador, donde pasé la época más intensa de mi vida. Viendo a esa gente trabajar era como quitar mi propio óxido acumulado durante muchos años de mi ausencia.
Yo no nací en Puerto El Triunfo, yo nací en otro puerto que se llama Puerto Viejo. Ahí vivíamos nosotros y de la edad de 12 años yo llegué a ese Puerto El Triunfo. Mi primer trabajo fue trabajar en la hacienda El Tercio, con la cuma, trabajando, ¿cómo se llama?, podando el algodón. Y después venían a deshijar el algodón, después venía a cortar el algodón, y en eso ya llegué a los 14 años. Antes de los 14 años yo entré a la empresa, porque eran 8 horas de pelar camarón con mis manos todas cortadas, rojas, todas con comezón en las manos de que la cosa del camarón nos enfermaba las manos, y así nomás nos daban guantes y con los guantes seguíamos trabajando aunque las manos nos dolieran.
When I arrived in Central America in 1978, I felt the infectious hope and optimism. The triumph of the Sandinista revolution announced that the nightmare of military rule and misery was coming to an end. As a former union organizer, I was captivated by the courage and faith of labor activists throughout Central America who faced death squads and torture to confront such obscenely unjust societies. 30 years later, I had the chance to meet some union activists and reflect with them upon the history of the labor movement. I realized that the stories of Alejandro and Gloria and others provide a window onto a moment of transformation in the lives of laborers in Latin America, a moment of great solidarity that was then torn asunder in Puerto Triunfo and throughout Latin America. Today, the stories of the port workers and their union sisters and brothers in the rest of the region are forgotten, buried under the toxic sediment accumulated since the defeat of the labor movements. That forgotten history offers us a chance to reflect on the defeats so that they will inform today's struggle for social justice.
Yo era el dirigente del sindicato de la industria pesquera en las empresas camaroneras. La mayoría de los miembros eran mujeres. Vaya, logramos mucho.
During the 1970s, as Alejandro was about to describe, Alejandro, Gloria, and a number of other rank and file leaders were able to achieve major victories for the something like 1,500 workers in 3 plants. But in order to do so, they had to overcome a series of obstacles, which included politics, because the large majority of the workers were politically conservative. Second, they had to overcome gender divisions. Women, not surprisingly, were paid significantly less than men, but they also had very little representation or participation in the union. And then finally, in terms of work segmentation, the factories were divided up into slightly higher and lower paid groups, even among the women. But most importantly, there was a seasonal workforce that comprised at least 40% of the workforce. And those people, almost all women, had no rights and no benefits. And they were excluded from the union and from all, like I say, rights and benefits. So part of the challenge for the union was to overcome those difficulties. And they did so and managed to include the temporary workers in the union and, you know, the large majority of women. And so by 1979, they managed to achieve a victory that included gaining full rights and benefits for the temporary workers. And let me just quote very briefly from the book in which I described that. The August 1979 strike victory was quite remarkable, as it came at a time of intense anti-labor repression and represented a blow against the logic of capital, a halt in the advance of neoliberal-style management practices, rejecting the segmentation and marginalization of temporary workers. Basically, what I'm talking about here is what's today often called flexibilization of labor, sometimes casualization of labor. And basically, that's the idea that no one has full-time work with full-time benefits, or relatively few people do. And so this was an early kind of move against it. Later on, the fishermen would do the same, and as I'll probably repeat, they did so without the support of each other. One of the reasons that the union was able to achieve this really remarkable reverse of a global trend was because they had managed to achieve a great deal of legitimacy within the port. And I'm going to illustrate that with one anecdote. And here I have to jump ahead a year. In 1980, a union leader named Noé was at home, and there was a knock on his door, and he opened the door, and there in front of him was the leader of the local death squads. That is, right-wing paramilitaries tied to the military who were going around executing people who they deemed as subversive. So of course, when he saw this guy, he freaked out. And yet the death squad leader immediately sort of calmed him down by saying, look, you know, I'm having a really hard time at work. I'm about to lose my job, and I want you to defend me. And so, somewhat shaken, he went to management the next day. The union leader went to management and explained the situation. And the management guy says to him, are you crazy? You know who this guy is? And he says, yeah, I know who he is, but he's a union member too. And so the management guy said, okay, we'll go along with you. So he goes back home, and then the next day, the death squad leader comes back to his house and says, hey, I wanted to thank you, for helping me out. And in gratitude, although I have to run a risk doing this, I have to tell you that you're top on the list. You have to leave town tonight and don't come back. So he did. Now he's in Houston. That anecdote, I think, does suggest two things. One, just the level of legitimacy it had, that it included people on the far right who accorded it legitimacy, and on the other, how relatively simple it was to crush the union. Part of the success of the union had to do with an alliance that they made with a left-wing labor federation. And that federation in the late 1970s grew exponentially, and they were a key part of a really important labor upsurge that led to a great weakening of the military regime that was in power. And so on October 15th, 1979, in the wake of the Sandinista triumph in Nicaragua, which triumphed in July 1979, in part to prevent a social revolution, a group of military officers, junior officers, allied with center-left political figures, overthrew the regime in a bloodless coup and established a new junta, a new government. And that government tried to carve out a reformist program. It was obviously rejected by the right, but it was also, as I'll show, rejected largely by the radical left as well. But there was a period of about 6 weeks in which death squad activity ceased. And then one of the arguments of the book is that this really was a lost opportunity, as one of the members of the junta said, to avoid the civil war, which then racked El Salvador with 75,000 deaths over the next 12 years. Because at that moment, the far right was shaken. They were trying to regroup, but they really did not. They were shaken by the takeover within the military. That is to say that there was a strong junior officers group which managed to throw out of the military a number of the hardcore right-wing people who had been involved with the death squads. And so during this period, as I'll briefly show, the labor and peasant movements made tremendous advances, but the radical left continued to oppose the government. Not, sort of, they were out of sync, that the rhetoric didn't quite match the reality. So I just want to read from what one analyst from the Universidad Centroamericana, the Central American University known as UCA, stated. This was his analysis in November 1979. The security forces adhered to the new guidelines, and from that moment begins a more tranquil period in which violent repression practically disappears, and we are allowed a month of much tranquility. The tomas, the occupations of factories, are negotiated and not responded to with force. And then talking about the countryside, the same analyst commented on the radio. The land occupations occur spontaneously as repression lessens in the countryside. The inhumane conditions that reign in the countryside make it so that the campesinos can only be kept silent, peaceful, and tranquil through increasingly brutal repression. When the repression stops, thus arises campesino demands, combative actions, and revolutionary spirit. So this moment lasts 6 weeks, and here I write commenting on those 6 weeks. The interregnum from early November to mid-December 1979 witnessed an unprecedented surge in agricultural worker and peasant mobilization that outlined the possibility of a radical restructuring of rural society. Most notably when people seized plantations and ran them, however briefly, as cooperatives. The real activity of subaltern movements thus escaped inherited categories of the revolutionary left. So that basically led, when that junta failed, by the end of December, the radical right began to mobilize and created a situation in which the civilian moderate left members of the government resigned en masse. And that led the way over the next months to a situation in which the death squads once reigned again. And basically during 1980, it was an extremely bloody year in which between 8,000 and 11,000 civilians, unarmed civilians, assassinated by the death squads. And in Puerto Triunfo, the death squads came as well. And I want to show another film clip in which, I try to depict, and I work with somebody who wrote a song to go along with this. And the song is basically meant to conjure the subjective experience of the bloody repression that comes to Puerto Triunfo at the end of 1980.
Todo terminó en 1980, cuando llegaron los escuadrones de la muerte al Puerto del Triunfo.
Nosotros fuimos perseguidas por la guardia, porque teníamos el carnet de fenastra. Y me dijo el capitán Quijada, no, Melchor estaba allá. Hija, me dijo, tenemos el carnet del sindicato de fenastra. Sí, capitán, le dije. Esconderlo o enterrarlo porque ya la guardia sacó la papelería del sindicato y de qué sirve que lo enterremos y lo quememos y la principal papelería la tienen ellos. Le dije. Mire, en esos días no dormíamos. Cuando íbamos a aquellas laticiones se perdió fulano, sacaron a fulano y lo mataron, desapareció fulano. Todas las noches 2, 3 desaparecían de aquí del puerto. Todas las noches y 2 amanecían muertos. A una la fueron a matar allá por la una, la afinada Juana, la fueron a matar por Santiago de María, le cortaron los pechos, era de la empresa ahí. A la otra la llegaron a sacar y les dijo ella, como ella tenía 2 niñas, si me van a matar, mátenme aquí, no me lleven tan lejos. La mataron ahí por la iglesia, por la escuela Fe y Alegría. Ahí dejaron a la Miriam. A la afinada Loncha la dejaron ahí donde estaba la lotería por pesca, ahí en ese callejón. A la vuelta estaba la lotería, ahí la dejaron a la afinada Loncha. Y así los andaban.
gente la conocía por su mirada de tuerto. No llevaba una guadaña, no iba vestida de huesos, sus telas como de araña le adornaban el pescuezo. ¿Dónde están los comunistas? Se escucha un gran quejido, el pobre sindicalista en su bocacha escondido. Soy la muerte escuadronera, mi patrón es Dawison. El que me vea de frente se moja en el pantalón, se moja en el pantalón. Soy su patrón Dawison.
Como comenzar a quitarle las partes genitales a las personas, o la lengua, o les pinchaban los ojos con picayelos.
Entonces le cortan esto de acá, ya para que se muera del todo. Le cortan eso y lo van a botar a los basureros.
Muchas mujeres lloraron en estas calles de lodo. La muerte se fue alejando y con la vida de todos. No lloren, hijos del triunfo, no culpen su mala suerte, se los llevó la guardia a que cenen con la muerte. La muerte va a dar la luz, nos grita una calavera, nació Margarito Cruz. Nació Manuel Rivera. De noche aullan los perros a una luna enrojecida. Los compañeros han muerto. Para cambiar esta vida, la muerte va a dar la luz, nos grita una calavera, nació Margarito Cruz. Nació Manuel Rivera.
Mi compañera, que se llamaba Juana, era madre de 4 hijos, chiquititos los niños, y también la fueron a sacar de su casa un 6 de agosto. Y la desaparecieron y a ella no la encontraron hasta casi a los 15 días. La encontramos casi en las montañas de allí de Tierra Blanca, por ahí en esos montarrales, y hallamos solo esto de aquí, la parte del cuerpo, sin manos. Las uñas todas se las habían arrancado, le arrancaron toda la nariz, le sacaron los ojos y le metieron un palo acá y le salía acá arriba. Y la conocimos porque la cabeza de ella la habían ensartado en un pedazo de palo así, en un palo mochado. La encontramos, bueno, la llevamos. Ese día que encontramos a la finada Juana, y al siguiente día llegaron a tocarme la puerta a las 12 de la noche a mí. Y justamente eran militares, porque de la guerrilla no eran. Y yo conocí a una persona nomás. De todos los que llegaron, como 40 personas con pasamontañas y con fusiles a las 12 de la noche. Y me tocaban la puerta bien feo. El siguiente día salí yo huyendo, sin deber nada, solo porque era sindicalista.
La Policía Nacional y el Ejército me capturaron en la sede de Penastras en San Salvador. siempre me tenían vendado de los ojos. Cuando me sacaban del sótano, me vendaban, me pasaban unos muros, bajaba escaleras, trepaba escaleras y no sé dónde me llevaban para la tortura. Pues allí me mantuvieron más de 4 semanas haciéndome interrogatorios, y en cada interrogatorio era tortura y eran presión psicológica. Me cantaban una canción de los desgraciados estos que decían: adiós, ángel mío, ya vas a partir, es que mañana te vamos a dejar ahora, mañana te matamos. Y así una guerra psicológica tremenda que les metían, que les decían a uno que iban a matar. Ya sabían las direcciones de donde vivía la familia, los nombres de la familia, y que los iban a matar si yo no daba nombres y direcciones de compañeros de penastra. Pero no me doblegaron, y luego emigré. Tuve que salir del país.
So following this repression, the Sindicato Tierra, obviously its leadership was debilitated quite a bit, and it functioned throughout the 1980s, but in a somewhat muted form. And certainly its leadership tried to avoid any outward identification with the guerrillas, with the left. By and large, after the repression, Puerto Triunfo did not really experience the war. It's a bit hard to understand why, since the whole country was in war, but it seemed like the guerrillas, the FMLN, treated it as a place for recuperation from injuries and that sort of thing. And the military, as I'll note in a second, tended to profit from it. So the area was an area that was basically free of violence during the 1980s, but certainly not free from conflict. The Sindicato Agua, the fishermen's union, began to take center stage during the decade, and they began to promote their own interests and to fight against a move by the companies to try and create a subcontracting system which would basically eliminate the union. In other words, rather than people all working for the company, they'd work for the captain, who previously had been a union member, and there was a union member who was working for the companies. So the union basically engaged in 2 very lengthy strikes, one from 1985 and another from 1987 to 1981, which is probably the longest strike in Latin American history. But one of the reasons that they could not achieve solidarity with the Sindicato Tierra was because of a practice they engaged in called La Movida, or the move, which essentially was a practice by which the fishermen would sell 1/3 of the shrimp that they had captured on the high seas. And they would sell that to people called pirate merchants. And those eventually would end up in military hands, military coffers. And, you know, basically the shrimp fishermen believed that they had the right to that product, that they met the company's guidelines, and then the rest of it was theirs. But that practice, as I'll read a passage from the book, was highly problematic. The impact of La Movida was highly consequential for the companies and the packing house workers. It had a significant impact on the company's liquidity. For the packing house workers, not only did the practice affect their livelihoods, but also it bred a deep mistrust between the primarily female labor force and the fishermen, whose machista lifestyles exacerbated the differences. From an acceptable mode of resistance, primarily in the 1970s, La Movida had become at once the enabler and the expression of fishermen's behavior that profoundly disturbed and alienated many female workers. There were also political divisions, and there the leadership of the Fishermen's Union allied itself with the Christian Democratic Party, which was in the government. I mean, the government, the Christian Democrats basically shared it with the military. And so the Fishermen's Union, in turn, supported by AFIELD, which was the international arm of the AFL-CIO, and very much worked with the State Department and presumably with the CIA, that they worked on two fronts. I'm talking about the Sindicato Agua. On the one hand, they wanted obviously to improve conditions for the fishermen, but they also aimed to try and eliminate Sindicato Tierra from the main company, Pesca S.A., because they still considered it, the US considered it, and they considered it to be a left-wing union. So there was that conflict of trying to displace them from the plant. That didn't work, but it certainly led to further animosity. And at the same time, they were pushing the Christian Democratic government to expropriate the plant and basically the whole shrimp fishing industry, and turn it over to a cooperative run by the fishermen and by the plant workers. So ironically, the plant workers, at least their leadership, in general, was sympathetic to the ideal of public ownership of companies. But in this particular case, because of the deep distrust between them, that idea of the cooperative, for which the Sindicato Agua fought considerably to win that did not come to fruition. Part of the problem that gets a little bit dense, and I'm going to avoid getting into too much detail, but part of the problem in the late 1980s was that the company owners, faced with La Movida and faced to some degree with the union, particularly Sindicato Agua, decided to commit a massive bank fraud of over $20 million. And that was very decisive. It was also very much done, out of view, as I'll read about. But it led to essentially the takeover of the company by the bank and to its eventual demise. And so let me just briefly read a couple of passages about that fraud, which I'll remind you that $20 million today might not sound much, but in El Salvador in 1985, it was a lot of money. The eventual arrival of tropical deindustrialization to Puerto Triunfo was a complex and contradictory process involving Cold War policies, harsh gender relations, La Movida, and different forms of corruption. A massive bank fraud perpetrated by the owners of Pesca directly contributed to the collapse of the shrimp industry and mass unemployment in the port. And yet the bitterness and anger in people's memories are reserved for the fishermen and their union. The fraud merits but a rare mention in the recollections of the packing house workers. The harbinger of neoliberalism, the crudest form of financialization of formerly productive activities, remains submerged beneath the chasm that it once caused and symbolized the onset of neoliberal social relations, in particular, the rupture of bonds of solidarity. Following the repression of 1980-81, that rupture occurred largely independently of the violent repression that operated throughout the country over the next few years. Today, the threat of violence again permeates the port. Not death squads, but gang youths symbolize that fear. Until very recently, an internecine struggle among subaltern youths replaced the workers' struggle. CAHI 18 and their MS-13 rivals for years have engaged in frequent gun battles over turf, recreating in a horribly distorted fashion the divisions that wrought Puerto Triunfo in the 1980s. The right, the bankers, and the owners wreaked their havoc, but largely behind closed wood-paneled doors or through invisible ghost accounts and untraceable wire transfers. Today, the military occasionally patrols the streets to protect the port residents from gang violence. And Ovidio, who is one of the figures in Sindicato Tierra, views those soldiers with deep ambivalence. The army had broken into his rancho in 1979, ready to kill him and his family. In 1981, they surrounded his house day and night. The new presence of the military reenacts a tragedy. It is certainly no farce. And then the bank fraud would eventually destroy Pesca S.A., and with it, the dreams of their workers for a dignified life. Yet the fraud was invisible to the people of Puerto Triunfo. Even after the Fiscalía, which is like the Attorney General's office, launched its investigations, the unions resisted Pesca and the bank policies with no clear understanding of the direct consequences of the fraud or the course of the investigation. When in 1991, the US government, at the tail end of its multi-billion-dollar effort to stamp out the leftist insurgency, pushed the Salvadoran government for, quote, transparency, unquote, it would be too late for the workers. For a brief moment, Puerto Triunfo became a microcosm of the global transition to neoliberalism, marked at once by a powerful discursive call for transparency in all transactions, and a reality in which the most decisive actions that affected ordinary lives took place in society's shadows. So the strike, as I'm saying, dragged on. At the end of the strike in January of 1991, some 540 workers and fishermen, all permanent, received a couple of $1,000s of severance pay. The largest plant closed for good. And the temporary workers, all of those temporary workers, really thousands between fishermen whom the Sindicato Agua had been fighting for, and the plant workers, none of them got anything. And so really those struggles, in a sense, were for naught. I do, however depressing the story is, I do attempt to end the book on a slightly optimistic note, and I'll end the film as well. But first I'll read a passage from the book, then end the film, and then we can open it up for discussion, questions, and so on. I'll do the best I can to answer that. The theorist Wendy Brown cautions against left-wing nostalgia, in part because the object of mourning has been a deeply flawed welfare state. Moreover, she convincingly argues that such an affect impedes the development of a serious alternative to the status quo. The port workers and fishermen look back on their moments of liberation and of triumph with pride and nostalgia, mixed with the bitterness of an ultimate defeat whose causes have remained as murky as the polluted Bay of Jiquilisco. This book has tried to shed some light through those turbulent waters of despair. A reader might recognize hope in the moments of liberation and solidarity shared by so many, and strive to create new societal forms that mirror such values, despite the pervasive neoliberal ideologies and policies that not only impede their development, but also deny their very right to exist. Memories of solidarity contain their own radical potential. They evoke long-censored dreams and aspirations for a dignified life in a better world. So let's pass on to the final clip from the film.
Las empresas nunca perdieron nada. Lo que perdieron fue la clase trabajadora, porque ya no había donde trabajar. Ya los barcos, hay un cementerio de barcos que hay.
Amidst the debris of tropical deindustrialization, many residents have struggled to eke out a bare existence. Why did the cooperative and the union struggles fail? Certainly the bankers and former owners did not want fishermen and workers to run their own enterprise. Neoliberalism, with its enshrinement of finance over productive capital, was triumphant everywhere, and Puerto Triunfo could be no exception. But there was a small chance for a different local outcome. Despite their shared interests, however, fishermen and plant workers could not work together to forge the cooperative, blocked by misunderstandings and prejudices. That precious fruit of solidarity, so courageously cultivated in the 1970s, was allowed to rot in the ensuing decades. Ana fled in November 1989 with her 6 children. Canada granted her refugee status, and today she lives in Montreal.
Me da decepción ver una empresa que le llamaban el monstruo de Centroamérica, donde muchas familias quedaron sin el sustento diario. Gente que ha sido luchadora, porque los salvadoreños somos gente trabajadora que luchamos por salir adelante. Y me da decepción al ver que las grandes máquinas que habían acá, todo destruido. Siento sentimientos al ver tanta gente afuera con necesidad.
After arriving in Los Angeles as a refugee in 1981, Gloria worked for decades in factories while raising 2 children as a single mother.
Primera vez que yo vengo para acá.
Alejandro arrived in Los Angeles as a refugee. He spent a year on a speaking tour on behalf of his imprisoned union compañeros. He then worked for 2 decades as a welder in an industrial wire factory, where he was president of his United Electrical Workers local. Aja was blacklisted along with his fellow members of Sindicato Agua and could no longer find work on the sea. He left Puerto Triunfo in 1991. He moved to Los Angeles with his family, where today he works as a chef in Universal Studios. Of course, his specialty is seafood.
Pienso de que las nuevas generaciones tomen conciencia de esta historia y que piensen en nuestro país, en querer un cambio realmente bueno y poner toda su fuerza, concientizarse de que la lucha siempre sigue y que no se detenga ahí hasta lograr un mejor país, para que nuestras generaciones tengan un mejor futuro. Por eso fue la causa que nosotros luchamos en esa época para tener un mejor futuro en nuestro país.
Thank you very much for that terrific talk and for sharing your research with us and your both your scholarship and your publications and your documentary. So again, I want to remind anybody who's watching us that you may post questions that you have for Jeff on the Facebook feed, and they will be relayed to me, and I will relay them to him. Thus far, we've got 4 questions, so I'll start with what we've got. The first, Heather Vrana here, following up on something said by one of the workers, Gloria, I think, in the film. And this was earlier on, she sent this in. The pain the workers' bodies accrued through their specific work is so striking. How did these types of body complaints figure into organizing, both through the union and maybe outside of the union? Since this pain likely differed between types of workers, perhaps this was an opportunity for revolutionary empathy or something like that. I ask because it seems to resonate with the body concerns of workers who are on strike today.
That's a great question. So in the 1970s, a lot of the demands of workers were not specifically female demands, although they were the demands that that really led to the mass organization of female workers, but they were demands that really did relate to the issue you raised. Offhand, I can think of a couple. One was for a first aid dispensary because of issues related to hands. Other demands, because a lot of the times people had to work in cold water, that somehow there were leaks and there was cold water. So they also made demands for rubber boots, for gloves, and issues like that. I mean, very concrete demands to deal with that kind of pain. The other demand, which was interesting, was a demand for a cafeteria. And that had to do with a specific issue because there were 8-hour shifts. They hardly had any breaks. But often single mothers or people without a support structure had to go home to get lunch, to prepare lunch. And there was never any time. In the end, that they simply, a lot of people just had to get through the 8-hour shift without any break. There was simply not enough time for them to get home and then get back again to finish the shift. I think they originally had a half an hour off. And so that was a focus, both to expand the lunch hour or the dinner hour, depending on what shift they were working on, and a demand for a cafeteria so they did not have to go home. So the demands were very much incorporated into that 1970s movement, and they did mobilize a large number of people.
Thank you. Another question. I feel a bit simple over this reaction, but I was surprised to hear about the death squad leader who was also a union member. I realize now this was perhaps relatively common. Is there any relationship between this phenomenon and the US AIFLD efforts to promote explicitly anti-communist and anti-revolutionary union organizing in Latin America and the Third World more broadly?
It's interesting. I actually think that this particular anecdote that I offered was pretty unique. I think, and as I said, I think it illustrated more than anything else the legitimacy of the union. But it also, I should also add that the union, which by the late 1970s was really under the control of, well, I mean, at least leftists had a serious influence. They consciously included a member of, there was an organization called Orden, which was the broad right-wing paramilitary organization from which death squad members were recruited. And they specifically, the leadership of the Sindicato Tierra specifically went out and recruited members of Orden to participate in the union leadership. So that helped them in various ways, both expanding their legitimacy and basically, but also they became friendly enough with the members of this organization that the organization would always tip them off about when the National Guard was going to come to bust up a meeting or something along those lines. And so, I know that it's not completely unique for a union to try and recruit members of the right wing into it. But I think it certainly, this particular incident is pretty unusual. I think A Field that you refer to operated very much in the 1980s, and they played a significant role in the Salvadoran Labor Movement, particularly because they were just out to get any left-wing remnants of left-wing leadership or a resurgent left-wing within the labor movement. Because from 1984 to 1987, 88, there was a period in which Duarte, who was the president, Jose Napoleon Duarte, tried to promote, tried to develop a base of support in the labor movement. And he did so with the assistance of Afield. But in so doing, he ran into this problem. If he allowed for an open labor movement, then the left, which had been driven underground, would be able to function again. And so that became a source, definitely a source of conflict, and it certainly affected Puerto Triunfo as well.
Okay, a couple of questions with related themes. Emily Taylor asks, I was wondering what evidence you've seen of transnational union connections between Puerto Triunfo and other Central American nations. It seems like workers face many similar problems of state repression, building solidarity, and rising neoliberalism. I'm thinking especially of Deborah Levinson's Trade Unionists Against Terror and her great ethnography of the STEGAC strike in Guatemala City in 1984-85. Which seems to have a lot of parallels to Solidarity Under Siege. And I'm also going to throw in a question from John Bodner here. You could keep them separate or together if there's any overlaps, but could you expand more about the elements that made up those who perpetrated the violence against your subjects? For example, any ties to US neoliberals?
Okay, first of all, yes, in the book, I certainly make reference to Deborah Levinson's work. It was, a very important book. And there are a lot of similarities between the two struggles. I'm not sure about the transnational links. I mean, obviously, certainly in the 1970s. In the 1980s, there were many more links, but those links mostly had to do with solidarity, like offering solidarity to Salvadoran workers who were in prison. I mean, at a certain point, when the U.S. kind of intervened most forcefully with the Reagan administration, although they were obviously tolerant of death squads in the sense that they knew that their allies worked with death squads, for political reasons, maybe for other reasons as well, they wanted to try to rein them in. And so often union activists were thrown in jail and not executed. So there was this solidarity movement that grew up, which included a lot of American unions, that is to say, American unions who didn't work with Afield. And there were also unions from Europe who lent a great deal of solidarity. Within Central America, I think everyone was, at that time in the 1980s, were dealing with their own either violent repression, or in the case of Nicaraguan unions, being, thrown into a defensive posture with regards to the United States intervention. In terms of the relationship of those groups to neoliberalism, I think that that's more of a tenuous relationship. I think the kind of the neoliberal move, which develops especially throughout the 1980s in the area, is at the same time tied to this idea that somehow or another some kind of functioning democracy will eventually emerge. And so the forces that push neoliberalism the most in Central America are also the forces which hope to achieve the aim, perhaps a shared aim, of crushing the left, and especially crushing the left labor movement, without resorting to having to execute them as the rest of the right wing had been doing. And I think so. It's more a kind of a traditional recalcitrant right wing tied very much to the landed oligarchy, who were the people who were promoting the death squad activity. I don't know whether that explanation is clear enough, but I would divide up the kind of extreme right into two groups, and one, a more traditional one, which was more prone towards supporting and organizing death squad activity, and the other more of a neoliberal right, which wants to achieve, the society that they both envision. That is to say, a society in which there is no left, but they seek to achieve it by different means.
Okay, thanks. A couple more paired questions. We have several more to go. The first, does the memory of this history of unionizing continue to shape organizing efforts today? On a related note, how has your film and work been received in Puerto Triunfo? And then from Polly Lauer, thanks for a great talk. Thinking specifically about the comments in the final scene of the documentary, I'm curious about the members of this community born in the late 20th century. How do the next generations raised outside of El Salvador understand this history as compared to those raised in Puerto?
Well, those are really good questions. Let me say two things. One, in terms of the book has been translated and will be coming out relatively soon, apparently. And I don't know how that's working, but that's what I've been told. Coming out in Mexico and in El Salvador. The film, a slightly earlier version of this film, we did show in Puerto Triunfo. And it was actually the part of the book passages that I read when I talked about this guy Ovidio, who is he's now a baker. He had been a Sindicato Tierra leader. His reflections on the army, because it was really strange. It was a very strikingly odd experience for me when I went to show the film. It was probably, well, you know how time's been affected recently. Either the summer of 2000, maybe early 2019. It showed the film in the port, and we get to the port, I just was walking around feeling something's really different about this place. And what it was that the military had come in and basically, really did a number on the gangs. And so what had been this really gang-ridden environment in which you'd hear shootouts too frequently, was completely different. And so that was the source of ambivalence of Ovidio and other people. Like, wow, we've got the military, we don't have the gangs, but hey, we got the military. So, so the reception at that film showing was curious. There were maybe 60 or 70 people there. Almost all of them were, veterans, as it were, of all these conflicts. And I really expected there to be further conflict, between ex-members of Sindicato Agua and Tierra, but that didn't happen. They all were kind of enthusiastic about it. But there was still conflict, and the conflict was really over what to do with the Sindicato Tierra building, which still existed. So it's kind of a minor issue, it would seem, but it actually erupted into a really heated conflict of people being suspicious of each other and so on. So in that sense, it was kind of depressing. On the other hand, I've shown it. I showed it in at various places in Southern California, and particularly at Cal State LA. And there was a large, large, relatively speaking. There was a presence of young Salvadoran Americans, and I was really taken aback because they just were extremely engaged with it, and sort of thankful just that it existed. That is this kind of record of union activity and popular struggle that was, to them accessible. And so I didn't have a chance to develop a lot of discussions with those, students and other people who were in the audience, but it did register in my mind that this kind of work sometimes is important just because it exists to some people. you know, that was gratifying.
That's great. I know another question. I know you've written about the academic value of documentary filmmaking in the past, but I have a question about method. Can you speak to the process of shooting a documentary while conducting research on the same material? I'm wondering how you approach separating and conceiving these two different but overlapping projects at the same time. And here I'm going to interject a bit because I know that in the book you speak a little bit about the differences in the reactions of the people whom you interview to when you're interviewing them with the camera and when you're not interviewing with the camera. And so maybe you could take that and the type of information you get. So maybe you could build that all into one response.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's, you know, all of these are good questions, and this one's particularly difficult because I don't have a solution. I mean, I have to say, maybe when I was like doing the work in Chinandega, Nicaragua in the 1980s, if I were that person, ojalá, I would, you know, I would be able to go to Puerto Triunfo on my own and just do ethnographic research the way I did in Chinandega. But the conditions are just not there to do that. I mean, I've already alluded to them. You know, somehow when you're young, you don't quite think of mortality in quite the same way. And so I guess the thing is, it was just a given. The interviews I were going to do were going to be under these difficult conditions, and they were going to be filmed. I mean, most of them were only filmed, and that posed a problem. The only compensating factor was that we were able to go back enough times and film the same person, so that there was kind of a loosening and a familiarity. And at a certain point, I think, or at least I want to believe, that informants stopped noticing the camera. So that on the one hand, but there was certainly a difference between the interviews in Puerto Triunfo and the ones in Los Angeles, because I did go out to Los Angeles, you know, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 times to interview people. And only, you know, of all the interview time, it was probably only, you know, a quarter of the time was spent filming, and the rest of the time would be interviews under normal conditions. And that was, you know, given the environment and so on, they were much more fruitful. And it just so happened that, and I also went to Montreal to interview the woman at the end, Anna, and those interviews were much, much better in terms of the possibilities of developing, just in terms of oral history. They were far superior. So there were limitations to the project. In terms of trying to conceptualize the difference between the two, it's curious because the first film project I got involved in when I was working with Carlos Enriquez Consalvi, I was doing oral interviews of the survivors of the massacre of 1932 in El Salvador. And I was doing this in the late 1990s. And just by chance, I started, I met this guy known as Santiago, and he ran this museum that co-sponsored the film, Museo de la Palabra y la Imagen. And he suggested to me that, you know, if I came across good interviews, so to speak, I should get in touch with him, and he would come over with a camera and we'd start shooting those. And that's how I got into this. It was just by chance. And so there I actually kind of ended up deluding myself somewhat. And I'll explain what I mean. So we did these, first of all, I'd interview all the people on my own, and then I would, like he had suggested, call him, and then we'd arrange to have filmed interviews of people who agreed that they were fine with doing that. And so eventually we got to a point where we figured, why don't we try and do something with this? And so we did. And we created this film, which I don't think is all that good, but it had a huge success in Salvador in terms of viewership, how many people saw it and the response to it and so on. And that was because it was on a taboo subject that hadn't really been aired in 60 years. It was a traumatic experience, the massacre. And it was suddenly public discussion. So that was gratifying, but it also kind of deluded me in thinking that there was no real difference, because it didn't throw me off. I'd done my research. It was, I was focused mainly on the book, and it didn't really, there wasn't much of a detour. With this last film, that, the filming, there was the issue I talked about in terms of how the filmed interviews probably weren't as good as they might have been under other conditions. But the real problem was when you try to do like a film that you're investing, how can I put it? You're trying to make a really good film, right? It involves so much more of the kind of work that has nothing to do with scholarship. So my delusion, which I started out with, was that they were absolutely, there was synchronicity, and that there was no real diversion of scholarly or creative energy. And then with this project, that illusion completely blew up.
That's kind of your own desencuentro, no?
Exactly. Yeah.
So one question, got just a couple more. About La Movida, you briefly hinted that back in the 1970s, it had existed but had not been a source of conflict. I wonder how the practice was different or was seen differently during earlier years. Do you think that a practice like that could have been developed in a way that would have also benefited the factory workers? And in that case, could it have been a site of solidarity rather than conflict?
Good question. Well, it started in it got going. It existed in really very small numbers before 1977. In 1977, there was a cyclone that caused 10 fishermen to disappear. I mean, they were lost at sea. And the reaction of the companies was basically that they did nothing to help the families of those fishermen. And that created this tremendous resentment among all fishermen, but among everybody in Puerto Triunfo. They were, disgusted with the company response. And so that's when this La Movida took off. And so initially when it took off, and people were really, selling, like I say, up to a third of their cash. When it initially took off, it had the support of virtually everybody, because everyone saw it as a form of resistance. And yet by the 1980s, I mean, for a variety of reasons, including that there were these other kinds of conflicts going on between the two branches of the industry. But by then too, it was a practice which was clearly having direct economic or impact on the companies and also on a lot of the packing house workers. Now, some of the packing house workers, of course, were either siblings or spouses of the fishermen. And so they were in this difficult situation where on the one hand, they were benefiting directly from the practice, but on the other hand, they were part of a union which in general is beginning to reject the practice. The other thing too is that there was, the practice also led to kind of the growth, at least during this period of time, of kind of a new class of people who were really the captains of these ships who got much more out of La Movida than the ordinary fishermen. They usually got, I mean, it depended, but at least 3 times more than anybody else. So you suddenly had this new class of people who were, flaunting their wealth, and they had, they built, 2-story homes. They had suddenly become really well off. And that also alienated a great deal of people. So by that time, it was hard to imagine any kind of solidarity. But that said, Clearly, the practice itself, I shouldn't say clearly because I'm not entirely sure about this, condition the idea of the cooperative in the sense that, hey, we create all the wealth, we should partake in it. And I think that from the point of view of the fishermen, there was kind of a congruence between the La Movida and this cooperative dream that they had. But because of all of the disunity, the Sindicato Tierra couldn't recognize that or couldn't get beyond their distrust of them.
Okay, we're at 5. I'm going to ask one final question from Alfredo Ramirez, who thanks you for a great talk and asks, in your opinion, where does your book insert itself in labor class studies? What are your contributions to Salvadoran historiography?
Good question. I'm not sure about Salvadoran historiography, other than I think there's a specific, well, I'd say two things. First of all, and I could be wrong on this, but I do think that the work on Salvadoran labor per se was mostly done in the 1970s and somewhat into the 1980s, and that it was mostly not done by historians. It was people who are working with, like Guido Bejar, for example, and others, Samoyoa, who were working on the labor movement as it was developing. So they were more coming at it as sociologists. And so there, in the history was looking further back. Since 1990, the Salvadoran labor movement really hasn't been a focus, certainly the industrial labor movement. And this, by the book, by the way, does, I talked only about the Puerto Triunfo part of it, but it also deals with the Salvadoran labor movement writ large. And so in that sense, it's, I suppose, filling what I perceive to be a vacuum in terms of a book that deals with Salvadoran labor during the 1970s and 1980s. And beyond that, I suppose, I am making something of an intervention and talking about the 1979 period and what was going on, sort of a detailed study of what was going on in the latter part of 1979. And that too makes something of an intervention there.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Jeff, very much for this talk and for all of your responses and engaging for everyone. And just a reminder, you should be able to see on your screen on Facebook links to Jeff's most recent book that he's been speaking from, Solidarity Under Siege, which is available through Cambridge University Press, and his documentary on Puerto Triunfo, which you can be accessed through Indiana University Press. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you, Jeff, so much for taking the time to do this for us.
Thanks everybody for organizing it. Bye-bye.